I think my major concern is, can we do this quick enough? And how can we speed it up? Because time is not on our side. And how can we create really, really quick change?
Hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? So we are in a nascent industry and need both guidance and advice. Anthesis brings together over 1,000 experts ranging from materials, sustainability, and waste professionals to provide a one-stop solution for more understanding in the sustainability space. Today, we get to speak with Claudia Amos, the technical director at the organization, to learn more about both developments and challenges in the space. Claudia brings in a lot of wisdom, understanding, and empathy into the space, and this was a very peaceful and learning conversation for me. Claudia also follows her passion for bringing more equality into the sustainability space by hosting her own podcast. Enjoy the conversation. Hello. Today we have Claudia Amos, who's the technical director of Anthesis, which is a large consulting company in the space of sustainability in general. But of course, we'll get to know more and more from you, Claudia. Thank you for taking the time and joining us, Claudia.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really glad that we finally made and got together and are able to have a lovely conversation and take some time.
It's great to have you here. Of course, I want to start with Claudia, the person. I read you grew up in Germany. And what was that like? And were there early influences that led you to the work you do today?
I think yes and no. Yes, I grew up in Germany. But by now I've spent more of my life in the UK than in Germany, I have to admit. But I think it definitely shaped what I'm doing today. So after school, I basically did an MBA in Germany. And part of that was environmental management, was what at that time quite rare. So it's one of the few universities that would offer that, and especially it had production technologies and everything. And as part of that study, I had an opportunity to work and did a 3-month internship with Miele, the white goods company. And at that time, that ages me a bit, the first EPR schemes were coming back. So the first producer responsibility tranche of regulations were being implemented. And Germany was certainly at the forefront of that. So my little project was to really look at designing or drafting a return system for white goods, which was quite a challenge, and then to learn everything. But it was super interesting. And I have to say, since then, I've been hooked on waste, or circular economy as we call it nowadays. But that really sparked my interest, and that has really come through all of my career. So after that, I finished my degree in Germany. I spent a bit of time in the UK working for a plastics consultancy, then went back to the UK to study, did an MSc in the UK, trying to marry the economics, the philosophy, and the social side of environmental behavior and behavior change. And then really got into consultancy and have been working in the waste sector for the last over 20 years, really up and down the waste hierarchy, from sorting, composting, anaerobic digestion, a lot of recycling, energy from waste, really everything that comes along.
The other thing I'm intrigued by is that you talked about it a little bit, your choice of education, your Masters of Science in Ecology and Society, because I just felt that was so apt. And considering that it was way before its time,
Yes.
In a way, today it's so apt. So what intrigued you to go that direction, and how did that training, learning, impact the direction you wanted to take in life?
That's actually a quite nice little story. So in my final year in Germany under this MBA, my professor did a big study into, I think it was mainly in Germany, about environmental behavior and also perception. So what came out of that study was that most people in Germany thought of themselves as very environmentally conscious, and it was definitely high on their mind and high on their agenda, but they weren't prepared to pay for it. So in short, that came out. So how do you encourage behavior change without additional cost? Waste management of any kind will have additional costs. So most products that are being recycled are more costly, and you definitely have a different value chain. And at that time, we didn't even think about, or not that much into natural capital accounting. So basically paying for your water, paying for all the natural resources. And therefore, I was really intrigued in that, a bit shocked by that. So then when I looked at moving to the UK and also studying in the UK, I really loved that course. And as I said, there was a really cool mixture of sociology, philosophy. So there was a lot of philosophy around scarcity and abundance, different concept of ownership and rights. So where does my right to consume end or start, and where your right starts? And I think that's really, really important if we now think about who's the polluter in this world and who's experiencing most of, for example, the plastic pollution. So I think that is some really, really valid concept, and the economic part as well. We live in a capitalist world, so how do we do that? And new concepts are circular economy, which didn't exist as an economic principle really at that time, more as a general material flow concept. But we are also now talking about no growth and slow growth, and have those debates, which are really apt. And I think maybe there are also different business models. So we don't need to own everything, because I think that's something that was not really thought about until a couple of years ago, that you can lease things. We are leasing cars. You can also lease the jeans. You can lease loads of items. We have much more sharing economies where we're sharing cars, sharing other items. And I think that a lot of these thoughts were already in that course, and that was really interesting. And the general picture of how do we influence groups. So a lot of the studies and the final projects were about how do we influence groups to do the right thing. Where do you have critical mass? If that is a cycle movement or if that's a recycle movement, how do you get people to behave differently, and how make that acceptable, cool for people to follow? And you don't feel like the odd one out just because you recycle your waste. And maybe just in connection to that was probably one of my biggest culture shocks in the UK, that I came from a culture where we had, 4 different bins. You could recycle all your paper, all your glass and everything. And then coming to a country where at that time we only had 1 bin, it felt really, really bad. And I know I made huge efforts to get my glasses supermarket on a bike because I didn't own a car, and all sorts of things, because it just felt so wrong to put it all back into 1 bin where I'd already been in a society and in a country where recycling and material separation was just a given. That was just the thing to do, and you knew that would go into recycling, and the UK was a bit behind at that time.
Yeah, and just before we got to recording, I was telling you I'm in between a family reunion, and I was talking to one of my sister-in-laws yesterday, and there was so much plastic again. I was like, can you get these gloves in a biodegradable way? And she literally gave me this look and said, "Babe, you have to this weekend stop bothering me about plastic." But it just hurts my soul to think that this is the amount of consumption. But that takes me to an interesting idea that you mentioned in your last statement on behavior change. And in a way, I had to, at least in my case, I had to shut my eye to that, because what happened was, you can't tackle everything. So in my world, it became, okay, how do you change material? And because I did not find myself in a place to really influence behavior. So how does one really go about it? And I know it's too simplistic a question and to a complex issue, but how does it really happen? And is it very cultural? I guess it changes from place to place. But what are your experiences with influencing behavior change to really get the consumer on board?
I think it is very cultural. And it's also about incentive, purpose, providing an explanation and making sense of it. For example, in continental Europe, you have a lot of countries where pay as you throw is really a given. And for example, in Switzerland, you have sometimes cuckoos on your bin if you put the wrong stuff in the bin and your neighbors would have a look. That would never happen in the UK. So it's really culturally different. But I think that's also what we are trying to do as Anthesis. I think we are trying to understand where our clients come from, and if they have the wish to activate their sustainability, then we are trying to help. And I think it's the same with a person as with a business. If you put a business case forward and a purpose forward and a vision forward, I think that's the way to start, and then really trying to enable it, because the more effort it is, or the number of barriers you have, the more difficult. So it's also trying to negotiate different barriers. And sometimes, as you mentioned, if you can't recycle material, can't recycle the product, it might be better to change the material, to redesign the product, to make it easier, and also less costly. So these are different ways. And I think it's also an acceptance. If you live in an office, or if you work in an office, or live in a society where everybody is recycling, and that is completely the norm, then it's really difficult not to. So it's a bit critical mass. If everybody does it, you feel the odd one out. If you are the odd one out, to start is always really difficult.
Yeah, or as my wife said, you create more pride. How do you create more pride in the idea of not littering or not wasting, but becomes complex. One of my simplistic thinking earlier was, if you create economic value in waste, then probably it'll take care of itself. But it doesn't quite work like that, right? As we delve deeper into the waste streams, I'm sure you'll enlighten us more on how it works. But what I saw was, at least I grew up in India, and I saw there was so little value in the multi-layered substrates, for example, that the rack pickers would never pick it up. So now you, like you were mentioning, it has to be a change from the organization that is using it. But the challenge for the organization is that they'd have no alternative at that scale. So it becomes a more complex problem, and I'm sure piece by piece we'll get into some of that. But before we get into Anthesis, I want to talk a little more about your choice of career. And you've had a variety of experiences in different consulting and expertise kind of different areas. So I just want you to throw a little more light on, that journey, and again, how you made those choices.
No, that's a really good question. So my first proper job was really with AMI Plastics, and that's how I learned to be a consultant, and did an awful lot of research and put the first mechanical recycling guide forwards. It was really an all-round. It was really nice grounding, because there were so many different things to do. I attended conferences, and it's all circular, so it was really funny. I gave a keynote speech at AMI Plastics Ocean Conference last week, and I basically started with, I came full circle, because I started behind the scenes running around with a microphone and making sure everything is ready as part of the AMI Plastics team 20 years ago. And now I'm giving a keynote speech. So I think it's also possible to start coming from a very working class family, to have the education, if you got the drive and the interest and the vision to do something different. The world is your oyster, but you also have to be given opportunities. So I was really lucky to have those opportunities to look into loads of different things. Then I worked for a consultancy that was focusing more on waste technologies, and I had some really good mentors. So I had a fantastic mentor who taught me a lot about business development, just the commercial side, really, how to be a consultant, how to behave, how to sell business, how to deliver a project. And at the same time, one of the technical directors there gave me a really, really good grounding in the technology, because clearly I wasn't an engineer. I was coming from the economic and science side or sociology side. And I was always interested. I love a good factory visit. I love going to recycling plants and see how it's actually done on the ground. And I think that interest was reciprocated. So I don't know, I got a lot of explanations how things work, why one process is better than the other, what the efficiencies are, what you need to look out for, what influences product quality, what creates more residues, what needs more energy, and all of those questions. So I've always been really, really curious. And after that consultancy, I joined a bigger consultancy in the UK, RPS Environment, and they were looking for somebody to build up the waste department. And that was a time in the UK where the big infrastructure push came. And there was a lot of public sector procurement. So I worked for at least 20 different local authorities, helping them with big procurement projects, mainly energy from waste, but also recycling, anaerobic digestion, and really build up that team to a large degree. So that was a real learning curve. And sitting in those procurement meetings and having those discussions is very, very interesting, because you get one side, you get the bidder who gives you all the spiel and everything. You need to do a lot of reading. So we had literally arch file folders that was before the time of big digital storage. It literally had walls full of arch files to read through, which were the bids all printed out on paper. And you learn so much about if people explain why they want the project. And then if you have to assess it, that gives you a fantastic grounding. And languages helped as well, because a lot of the technology was coming from Germanic countries, so Switzerland, Austria, Germany. So there was a lot of technology transfer. So being able to speak the language and look at the other side, and maybe also dealing with a bit of German over-engineering was very interesting. Also with the culture, people coming in saying it works here, so it must work with your waste, but not realizing that the regulations, that the requirements are very different country to country. So then helping people with the cultural shift to say, we have a different approach. It's not about better or superior or inferior. It's more about our regulatory approach is different. And with some things we take much more seriously, and others we are maybe a bit more lenient. So you just can't come with your standard package. You also have to look at what is the cultural background, what's the regulatory frameworks, what is the assessment policies you need to meet, because there were very different targets in the UK than in Germany, for example.
So many questions stemming from that.
You promised me it would be a long podcast.
It will. I haven't even gotten into what you do now. But the first thing, so you when you mentioned in the beginning with AMI plastic, a mechanical recycling guide. Is it to do with how do you take something and chop it into different pieces? What does that mean? Just from a listener's perspective, and of course from my own learning as well.
No, these are more, at that time there were more lists. So it basically was a list of the key European recyclers, where people could literally look up to say, I got this material and I would like to get it recycled. And most of it was post-industrial waste, so end-of-factory waste. So let's say a BMW or somebody else was looking at, okay, I got loads of bumpers, they weren't making the spec, what do I do with them? So then they would be able to look them up and find a recycler that could recycle the material. At the same time, it would also give a really good overview about the size of the industry, or the data you need to understand the market structure in different countries. So that was the background data as well. But it was a quite simple document, more a list of different recyclers. But by speccing what are important information people would like to know about a recycler, it really gets you into understanding how people would look for something, what do they need to understand, what the volume may be, what are the polymers they are doing. I can't really remember where they are. So lots of maps and details about contact details. So at that time, they could literally phone them up and say, we got 5 tons of polypropylene. Would you be able to recycle that and send it back to us? Because then we can reuse it in the production.
Yeah, and I'm sure it gave you different insights into different technologies and what people were doing. And then, of course, as you get into it more, you probably have that in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
I can talk to these guys about it. The other one, which I experienced, and you mentioned it, and you clearly have experience in that, is the whole energy from waste, refuse-derived fuel, which also became a very big thing in India at one point. And it was very interesting because biomass was so limited.
Yeah.
But at least in India, what we found was the ratio of wet is to dry was not right in a way. So the quality of the refuse-derived fuel was extremely poor because there was almost 70% wet waste. So would love to learn from you on how that works, the refuse-derived fuel or energy from waste. The other thing which I'm always intrigued by in that domain is that when we look at it from a basic science principle, that everything changes form, but ultimately stays within the ozone layer. And how does that impact? Because we also went to countries like Singapore at one point where we were trying to introduce more compostable materials, but they were like, we are not interested because we use all our plastics to generate energy. And if we remove all the plastic, then how are you going to generate energy? So, so there's a dichotomy there. So how do you address these two things? One is the quality of the fuel itself from waste. And of course, I know many of the countries, like Nordic countries, even import waste. And then how does the technology work so that the materials are not actually leaving gases in the air or something like that?
Yeah. So the first one is, I think we need to go a bit back, a bit of the history of waste management, because if you think about it, initially the waste management was mainly a public service. It was about public health, it was about cleanliness, it was about safety, and really reducing illnesses all around. Then I think we moved into an era about landfill and landfill diversion. And that's really where the energy from waste come in. So we had a bit of recycling, we had this waste hierarchy principle, but the focus was really, we collect some materials separately, we recycle those, and then there's an awful lot of material still left, and that's the residual waste. And that was the waste that was supposed to go to waste to energy because it wasn't allowed into landfill anymore because of landfill bans or landfill taxation. While these initial type of regulations were very much aimed at putting it into recycling, it had a bit of a counter effect that it was go to energy from waste because the volumes were high. That was the easy way forward. You could create renewable energy because the plants in Europe really need to be recovering energy, so they couldn't just blow it up and just burn it up. It would need to be recovered in terms of heat and electricity. So that was one of answering a bit of your questions regarding the gases and where it goes. And I think now we have the era of the circular economy where we're really thinking about, okay, out of landfill, we always will have some amount of residual waste, but the majority should really go into recycling and reuse. And this is where we are. So I think it's a bit historic where we are going and where the regulations are. And when you ask me about behavior change, a lot of the time, because behavior didn't change or didn't change quick enough, we had all these market interventions. And unfortunately, some of the market interventions didn't really go the pathway, maybe how they were originally intended, or they weren't only halfway. I don't know, landfill to energy from waste instead of landfill to recycling. So I think that's part of it, that as soon as you start to intervene into a market and you set regulations, people will find the best path through it and the cheapest path through it. So, and I think we can see that happening when we did the study last year with the Circulate initiative in Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and Thailand. It's similar. It's also then waste to energy is coming really to replace illegal dumps. Landfills are full, and it might be one step. But then there's also recycling, and the RDF situation is really difficult. So in the beginning, it just went, the raw residual waste went into the incinerators. And now we are thinking more about RDF, and often RDF into cement kilns and steel mills, for example. But that is a different RDF. And there's actually in Europe no clear description of RDF. That's a really broad category. So the materials that go to the cement kilns is what I often call is an SRF, so solid derived fuel, because that got a specification that's quite a high CV, often over 20 megajoules and very dry. So to your question, should it have organics in there? That's actually quite a refined fuel where organics are being taken out. And in Europe, you also have a lot of organics being taken out because you often have mandatory food waste and green waste collection. So that already changes our waste composition and our residual waste composition. And we can see, I think it was in Thailand that there, and also in India, that there are some real efforts to have this wet waste being separated from the residual waste. Firstly, to reduce mass, because food waste and green waste is very heavy because it's wet. And then also the volume, and we know there are other options like composting and so on, where you can really create more value from the wet material and the food waste material. So I think, answer to your question to the first part, there is a historic reason why that's an option, and that fuel has been changing over time and is still changing now. Now we are trying to get plastics out of the residual waste. That reduces CV a bit, but the wet element has a bigger impact, really. And we have been accounting for this in mass, so in tonnage. So we haven't really looked at CO2. And now we're starting to look at CO2, and then the composition is changing again, because clearly if you have a lot of plastics in the residual waste, you have a lot of CO2 in there, and suddenly you have to pay carbon taxes on that. So the cheapest way is to remove the plastics out of your residual waste before it goes into your energy from waste plant. And I think that's what I also love about the industry. It's constantly changing. There's always development. There's always new stuff. There's new stuff to learn and understand. And having that carbon economy is really helping to understand us a bit more about the chemical content, and then really looking at energy from waste is the right way, or should that, for example, be converted into sustainable aviation fuel because it's suitable for that as well. Or as a replacement fuel, for example, cement kilns to reduce coal and reduce oil, and have that as a sustainable fuel, or more sustainable fuel than fossil fuels.
Okay, and a bunch of questions that emerged from there as well.
I've just answered one. You can't just ask more every time.
Yeah, I know. It's because there's so much to learn in this, and again, it connects to what we were talking about earlier in terms of behavior change. What at least I've found was that if you don't segregate at source, it becomes a very expensive exercise as we go further down the stream to actually remove everything. And then, of course, there's contaminants coming in. So one was, like at least regulatory, and in a place like India, it was very difficult to implement that, that how do you implement something like segregation at source? We were even at one point, we were running a program in the city, and we realized that people are just not going to do it. And of course, we had no regulatory authority. It was more a volunteer program. But what we started doing was that the guy who would collect the garbage would actually do the segregation at the cart. But there was never any way to actually find out how non-contaminated the garbage was, because we were trying to, we were just trying to see if we could take zero garbage to a landfill or a land dump in India. It's not really even a landfill. But the two questions that I had was, that first is, you said removing plastic from the waste. I thought that is what will burn. So to clarify that for me, I thought that is what is going to give the highest calorific value. And the second was, you talked about creating fuel from the waste. And I've heard about this a lot. But as far as I have understood, it's so expensive. And of course, I'm talking about pyrolysis and that sort of thing, that it never really becomes economical. And I don't know how the quality of fuel is. So yeah, I'd love to learn from you how that works.
Yeah, I think firstly to the cost of source segregation. It is the cheapest way because it's done by somebody else and not paid by the state. But there are also a lot of models, for example, in Indonesia, you have a lot of waste banks where people bring source segregated material and then get paid money into an account. So it's literally like a bank. So you monetize the segregated materials you bring. So that's one way to incentivize it, to have good quality of material. But especially in these countries, what we found, and that was a bit what my paper was about last week, was that only addresses 10% of the plastics in the waste. 90% is in the mixed waste. And we still don't get it out. So I feel it will still pay, and also has a higher security of supply if you have sorting plants. And if they're efficient sorting plant, yes, there is a cost, but it's definitely an efficient way to get different materials and to get to the vast majority of material. And I think that's where we need to look at if we have a formal waste system or if we have a more informal waste system. The drivers are very, very different. And what I loved about looking into India was also the absolutely fantastic entrepreneurial spirit about how people recycle and reuse and repurpose material. Similar in Vietnam in craft villages. That's a real business where people are doing exactly what we are trying to do in a very complicated way in the West. So it's not all good or bad. I think it's very different systems. On the plastic removal, I think you have to understand where it goes. In a normal big waste incineration plant or waste to energy plant, the CV expectation is actually not that high. They don't want too much or too high a CV in the waste because they're normally spec'd around 10 megajoules per kilogram, and that's probably and they're making their money from the tonnage. So how they're spec'd is you create a certain amount of gas or energy, and then you spec how much waste you need to create that amount of gas. The higher your CV or energy content per ton of waste, the lower the volume, because it's basically a multiplication. So if it's 10 times 2, you get 2 times 2. If you got 5, you got 4, and you get paid for the tonnage. So your interest is to get the maximum tonnage through, and you want a lower CV. So that actually works with the economics of the waste to energy industry. With cement kilns, it's different because they are used to taking coal with a higher CV, so they need the high CV and the dry, and they love the plastics in there. But again, they also got carbon taxation, carbon targets, so they have to be careful that they don't have too much in there, and especially no PVC, so there are no chlorine because that damages the plant. So that is really the rationale around it. And then your final question was about using it in aviation fuel. I think this is the next stage. And about costs, I think those plants are quite large. A lot of them are larger than, or they're not trying to be larger than energy from waste plants. So you have often very good economies of scale. And again, it's then what value do we want to get out of these RDFs and these solid fuels? And the technology is definitely coming, and there's a huge support because the alternatives of decarbonizing the aviation industry, there are not that many options. And as you said very early on, to have all of this with biomass is also not in our interest because biomass is either nature, biodiversity, or are we using land for food or are we using it for energy crops? I think that's a really key discussion. And in Europe, there's the ILUC, the Industrial Land Use Directive, which basically is very prescriptive if you can use the land for energy crops and where you get subsidies for renewable fuels or not. So basically land that can be used for food won't get renewable energy subsidies if you are growing, let's say, maize for anaerobic digestion plants. So they have really tried to limit the use of land for non-food crops.
Do you have something to add to the conversation? Use hashtag #GoodGarbage to add your own insights, ideas, and opinions on regenerative packaging and zero waste solutions. Now, let's get back to the conversation. The other challenge I've had, and of course, learning from gurus like Bill McDonough, there is no such thing as recycling, as he talks about. And, there's no such thing even as plastic because it's all different. Like you mentioned, polypropylene, it could be polyethylene, it could be high density, low density, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, it's kind of, I would say, probably next to impossible to actually segregate each type of plastic into its own kind of domain, because just segregating plastic on its own is a challenge. So, what do you think of the idea that ultimately it is getting downcycled, and there's ultimately an end. You cannot downcycle anymore, and of course it becomes that flimsy kind of film in the end, which is black or something in color, so that nobody sees what is inside. And the second thing is the challenge with which as consumers we don't see is the idea of the amount of effort and transport and carbon footprint it takes to actually get it to a recycling plant and to get it back into the consumer space. It could be transported all the way from United States to Vietnam or somewhere where it's recycled. And of course, there's an impact to that. So again, two thoughts that I would love to have your ideas on is, this idea of downcycling, and there is no such thing as plastic because it's all separate. And of course, the impact that gets created from the whole system of transport and where the plant is.
I think the interesting bit is often transport is the lowest carbon impact. So I think transport is not really the deciding factor. And also, while you need a single polymer, I don't think you need to then separate into the nth degree. So I feel recycling got a place, and good quality recycling is still what we are aiming for. But I think we also need to think about what is it doing? It's replacing fossil fuel. So while reduction of consumption is definitely our highest aim and reuse, we also have to be realistic. If we produce something, then recycling could be an option, and it all fits into this kind of waste hierarchy thinking in terms of it. Should we make everything into fence post and kind of like traffic furniture? No, not at all. But if we are using refuse sacks and they are made from recycled plastics, why not? I'm married to a farmer, so there's a lot of silage wrap from the bales and everything, and that gets recycled and often recycled back into silage wrap because the color doesn't matter. So I think there are also products that are there for. But on the food packaging, yes, I think we are struggling to create good quality recyclables using the mechanical pass, and especially food grade to food grade, because we don't want any contamination in there. But that's where chemical recycling often comes in, where you have a different route and a different pathway, but you also have to look at it. When we did the study 2 years ago with the Closed Loop Partnership and the Center of Circularity, we did some very detailed modeling, or I'm saying we, in our partner and as Environmental Clarity, did some very detailed modeling where we literally compared like for like. So we compared the whole life cycle to see what is better, creating virgin plastics or creating recycled plastics in a whole lot of different means. And it's a publicly available report, so everybody can download that and also download the methodology for that, which is a bit different to the normal life cycle assessment because it takes into account how many cycles you can do. So with mechanical recycling, people say it's 5 to 7 cycles, then the material is not good enough. That might even be a bit high, it might be lower for some materials, and depends on how it's being collected and what it is. But with chemical recycling, because you're going back to the hydrocarbon, you get much better quality. And with a lot of the materials, you have really good quality, and therefore you have a lot of ways you can recycle it and a lot of cycles in there. On the other end, you also got a higher carbon impact for those technologies, and while they varied on a scale, they were all better than creating virgin plastics. So then I think the choice is not consuming and not producing. Absolutely fair enough, but if we produce, then I feel recycling got a place, but we need to look at it. We need to definitely be cognizant also where we recycled. Don't know. We need to get our act together in Europe, in North America, and build up our recycling infrastructure, because sending it to Southeast Asia or to Turkey nowadays or to Poland is just not an option. And on the other end, we need to enable other countries to recycle properly, because a lot of our production is in those countries. And I think that economic value should also not go out, because there's environmental pollution on one side, but then there's also the enormous amount of resources that are there, and that should stay in those countries. The value should stay there. and then we buy the product and pay for it properly. So I think the location of recycling facilities is definitely something to look at, also from a social and an ethical aspect, because often we are trying to have those, dirty industries in countries where nobody can see it. But really, recycling is not really a dirty industry anymore. I think it has really cleaned up its act. There's still cowboys out there. But what we have seen in our studies that often also with the informal sector and the lack of regulation, permitting for plant, it's really difficult that actually the act of recycling is creating additional pollution, or the other way around, that the sorting and separation creates the pollution, and then the recycler looks very clean because that's not accounted in their kind of like scope. So so I think it's difficult. It's really looking at it in detail, and I find it really hard to make a general statement to say it's not good or it's better. I think definitely reduction, non-consumption is the best, and anything else we have to have a really close look at what makes sense.
And that's also, it's interesting you mentioned that. Number one, thank you so much for informing me that transport is not as high an impact, because I always felt that that's huge. You're transporting something halfway across the world and then recovering 50% or something like that. But it's great to know that it's not as high as I had probably assumed. And the other part that you mentioned in passing was the biomass side, and then using biomass as a fuel. What do you think about using waste biomass? Because, of course, people use sugarcane waste. We've used rice husk in the past. But in the end, it is still creating a lot of ash, for example, which may or may not be used. It could have better usages. You could compost it and do that. But is that lesser of the two evils? How do you see it? How do you see that idea of a waste biomass being used?
Yeah, I think, again, if it replaces fossil fuel, it's definitely better, even from a life cycle analysis. And I think what we are now looking at, for example, is also at biochar. So using different types of technology like hydrothermal reactions, lower temperature pyrolysis, to actually create a fertilizer type substance to improve soil mass. And that's going back to we have done some things, and they were not always done the best. They were the best at that time, but we are starting to have new technologies, a new option where we can actually do that. So we can create some energy, but we can also create other fertilizers or soil improvers that can be used and that really have very good value and get you a bit over the ash problem. And also the ash you have is actually not, well, if it's not hazardous, then with rice husk and so on, it's quite a benign product. So it's definitely there, but there are uses for it to drive it. And also rice husk is a residue, isn't it? It's not, there's nothing else. And I think that's always also in Europe, the question is, do you get the wood chips out of the forest, or should it stay there to create humus, new topsoil, to create it? So I think that's a decision, again, where it makes sense, and if also the volumes that are being used. And I think that's the same with carbon offsetting or insetting. Is it better to have to reduce it all, or to be able to carbon offset it with other measures? So I don't think in our industry and the whole sustainability there's always one right answer. I think there's a lot of options, and you have to look, and you have to create the evidence to make a good decision. And I think that's what we are trying to do at Anthesis. That's why, we got a whole set of experts. I mean, I've got about 1,000 colleagues now, and it's really nice. I can reach in loads of different places to get an expert to say, I understand this part, but I don't understand the carbon part, or I don't understand the water part. Because that's often with bio-based materials. CO2 looks fantastic, and then if you look at the water balance and monoculture and social and ethical impacts, it's often a bit more difficult to say it's a good material. So that's why it sounds a bit weaselly, and if I can't make up my mind, but I believe it's true that you have to look at the evidence and you have to understand the questions you need to ask. And if you don't know what questions to ask and how to inquire and critically assess something, then there are loads of experts out there and loads of people who know a lot about different things.
I'd love to know about Anthesis, and for the listeners as well. I know that there's a wide spectrum, and you mentioned 1,000 colleagues. I had read 800, so of course it's grown more. And so there's a wide spectrum of activity all within, it seems to be all within the sustainability space, but it goes as wide as even branding and things like that. So would love to know the how Anthesis even evolved and how it started and what it does and what are the areas that it addresses.
Absolutely. So Anthesis was really founded with the aim to have a global sustainability consultancy. And it started in the US and the UK with the acquisition of a number of companies, including the company I worked for, and trying to bring all of the skills that are needed to make exactly those decisions and address sustainability. And the more we understood, the more we also identified the services we need. So if I do the technical assessment, have the options assessment, or my colleagues do a sustainability report, somebody needs to communicate that. And the communication and the presentation is really, really important for people to understand. And a lot of these subjects are very, very complex, very data-driven, and not everybody loves an Excel spreadsheet. So I think that was the whole idea of having a whole host of services together and really providing a global opportunity. And we understand ourselves as partners. So we work with our clients in partnership and trying to identify areas to improve sustainability. That is sometimes compliance, that is beyond compliance, that could be carbon assessment, life cycle assessment, that can be waste option assessment, packaging footprinting, infrastructure assessment. We look at water. We really look at, we got soil, we got a regenerative agricultural practice, we got sustainable chemistry. So if my polymer knowledge runs out, I have colleagues I can ask to say, actually, what about the chemical composition? Is that recyclable? What are the hazardous material additives I need to be aware of? And that's a whole ethos around Anthesis. So today, as I said, we are over 1,000 people. We are all around the globe, North America, South America, Middle East, most European countries. We're starting to expand into Asia. I got a colleague in China and Hong Kong. And in the recent weeks, we just merged with Walbrook, who are now providing more expertise on the social and ethical side of the ESG, so the environmental, social, and governance assessments, and also better branding and design and labeling with Charles Cannon in Switzerland, who have joined us just a couple of days ago. And actually today, the press release has got out that we got a new investor, Carlyle, who are on board to really help us grow out the services, because the acquisition has been one part, but we also had an enormous growth in organic growth and the actual growth of our offices organically all over the world. And I think we can just tip our hat to Stuart McLachlan and the board and the management team that they had the foresight to be or to set Anthesis up at just the right time, because I have to say 20 years ago in sustainability, this wouldn't have worked. So we needed a Greta Thunberg. We really needed the data around climate change, and we are in the decisive decade, and it's becoming clear every day, and everybody understands that what the impact of our daily chores and daily work and daily living standard is. So I think that is something where Anthesis really tapped in and provides solution. And we are being realistic as well. So we understand the economics around it. We understand the pressures that most of our clients have a core business. But sustainability is actually becoming the core business, because about 5-6 years ago at the early stages, there was always a sustainability manager somewhere in a cupboard with a small portfolio, not even tapped into the board with a remit basically to do compliance. nowadays sustainability is a boardroom and a C-suite subject. And there's not one sustainability manager, there's a whole department. All sustainability is part of the core activity. And I think that has really changed. And that's maybe also then creating the behavior change we have all been looking for, that if the corporates behave differently and think about sustainability as a real risk to their business every day, if it's supply chains, consumer behavior, and so on, that creates a change. And that's really where we are very, very busy in supporting clients and hopefully doing a bit better for the world and creating a world where everybody can thrive.
And I'm sure you are. But looking at the gamut of activities that you guys do, I'm sure, and then we'll get into your clients because you have like the who's who of the world trying to work with you. So what are the key areas where you get the maximum demand? Is it LCAs? Is it what is the biggest side of that consultancy, or what are the biggest 2-3 that the clients are asking for? And that question comes from the perspective of what is troubling people most, and that's where they will run to you.
Yeah.
So what is that, and what are those areas that you get the maximum inquiries for?
I think it's really hard to say. So I sit in the production and consumption side of Anthesis. So that's basically circular resources, and then it's clearly in the waste department or circular economy sector. So we do an awful lot of packaging, footprinting, packaging assessment, recycling roadmaps, implementation of circular economy, because circular economy is very complex. So where do you start? Do you start at the waste end sometimes? Sometimes we start really at the packaging and design end, or somewhere in the middle. And then it's really hard to say. There's a lot of net zero activity, so around LCAs, but also offsetting, insetting, then a carbon certification, sustainability reporting. So I think it's fairly evenly matched, and a lot of times we do different things for the client. So they come with one problem or one symptom they have or one service area they need, and that might be driven by compliance, or that might be driven by then a cost they're incurring. And then we often work with them on a lot of different subjects, really as an extended service. So it's really hard to say where most of the demand is. And I think that's how we are being set up is really to do exactly that. So they get a global service and the same level of service all over the world, because they are global companies. So they need to understand how they tackle the problem in North America, as well as in Southeast Asia, as well as in Europe, or in a specific country in Europe, because even if we often have European framework regulations, we still have national interpretation. So it's a bit of a jungle to see, even just in a small part of Belgium, you might have a different target level than somewhere else. So it's quite just having this detailed knowledge, and then having the local colleagues that understand the local circumstances is really important. And what we're trying to do is really have this cooperation. We don't have any silos. We have a really open management systems that our project teams are being put together to what the client needs.
Yeah, and I saw like you were in over 40 countries. And again, when I look at the list of your clients like Cisco, Gap, Unilever, Johnson & Johnson, these are all behemoths. And, of course, they probably have their own specialists as well. But of course, you're probably offering a service that they cannot do it internally or not as effectively, and hence they come to you. So I wanted to understand, is there a lot of effort that you guys have to do in terms of business development and pitching, or it's just coming? It's just the time is now, and things are just coming, and you have to decide what you take and what you don't take. How does that work?
I think a bit of both. I think one of the things what we are very good at, we looked also the type of services we supply. So we started really early on to have a digital offering, and for example, develop our own software and develop our own digital products to do things more efficiently and more effectively. So that's often a service that clients really appreciate. Instead of working through their own Excel spreadsheets, we got some digital product and tools that can be used, if that's a footprinting tool or an assessment tool, or we built a cool farm tool absolutely ages ago. circularity metrics, risk assessment on the ESG side, materiality assessment. So these are ready-made tools that we can use with our clients to make this really streamlined, quick, and much more cost efficient. So I think that's a bit different, but we're also different than other consultancies because we have the own development teams to design those products and make those fit for purpose. We got for example, big city tool that our cities team developed where local authorities can screen what are the best measures to reduce CO2 and achieve their CO2 targets. And that has been a tool that was built for them. So now it's basically the cities got able to use it. What are other tools? For example, in the UK, we built a smallish tool for local authorities just to model the impact of different collection systems. So what is the cost in changing collection systems and what do you get out? So that's, I think, something where software would normally not something in a sustainability practice, but I think because of that added service, a bit similar to the reporting, the branding, the communication is all part of the package because you can't just do one thing and then hand it over to somebody. Because even in discussion with my branding colleagues and design colleagues, I got a lot of technical nows and they understand how to take that forward. And they ask very different questions to somebody in my own team because they are not subject matter experts, but I need to find a way to explain something really complex, and then they can visualize it, they can take it forward. But it's a really good partnership and it really keeps you on your toes because you can't just use all those terms and terminologies that come with RDF and EFW and things like that. They just look at me and come like, no, please speak English. So it really forces you to think things through and fully understand it, because if you don't fully understand it, you can't explain it to somebody who's not a subject matter expert, because you get found out. You can't just use your terms and terminologies and assume everybody understands that.
And what about, so you talked a lot about waste and recyclability and LCAs and carbon offsetting, etc., that domain. What about ideas around materials creation, innovation? Is that an area that Anthesis as a company tackles if a client wants to not just replace the material by an existing material, but also enable a new material to come to be? Is that part of the portfolio and how does that work?
More in terms of innovation research. So we wouldn't develop the material ourselves, but we could, for example, our sustainable chemistry team, or we got some packaging engineers as part of the team. They are able then to, for example, you want to replace PVC, let's say, what can we replace it with? And then we would look first into the market, what's already in the market, what do competitors do, and then really go into it's called Anthesis Frontiers, which is our innovation lab, if you want. There's my colleague, Emily Bartlett, got a fantastic database where she's tracking those new materials, innovations, we come across, because I do, while waste is my key subject, my main work is really in commercial due diligence, so helping investors invest into waste, renewable, biomass, plant and infrastructure or companies. So often we come across project developers having a new idea, a new technology, a new material, and then help them to find investment, do market analysis, because often they're very technology or material oriented and haven't really thought about who am I actually going to sell this to, who needs it, what problems am I solving with that. So that connection with the innovation space would be something we would be looking at, but we don't have laboratories or not yet. You never know, ask me in a couple of years, but at the moment we would really rely on the outside sources and our own databases and trackers where we're looking at alternatives, and we're constantly looking at what people are using, if they make good experience, if that's working or not, what are the issues around it. Often it's the issue around tooling and equipment, or the material is very expensive because it's not there. So a lot of the biodegradable and bio-based material has been expensive. like PMA and other materials, and are not produced in large quantities. How can we scale that up? What is the issue around it? And that's really how we would tackle it.
So you would look at how do you scale it up, for example, because yes, I do realize, that's a big challenge as well, because the size of the challenge is so large that, you have to be able to scale materials. Otherwise, they remain a good idea, but they don't really end up solving the bigger challenge.
And I think it's also getting into the market, because sometimes you need a certain volume. I always I said when tire pyrolysis was around 20 years ago, Michelin or Pirelli are not changing their tire composition if you produce 50 tons. They want the quantity so they can change a whole tire range. But you need to get up the scale, and then you got the chicken and egg problem where you're trying to scale up, but you don't have a market. But the market tells you if you produce this much, then we would actually buy it, because then it's worse than spending 3-5 years to develop a new tire with that material. So I think that is always a question that's often also where you need to find the right investors, where you need to look at maybe other applications, maybe have something where you think, okay, my ultimate application might be tires or textiles, but I go first back into PET bottles because that's an established sector, or I go into non-tire applications that are lower value but create a pathway for me to have the long-term development. So that's also where we're trying to help and try apply our expertise and market knowledge to help them a bit on the pathway.
Exactly, because we were, for example, working with Unilever on replacing some of their shampoo sachets in India. And then they told us we need 16,000 tons annually just for shampoo sachets, not for their soap packing or anything. No. Just those little sachets was that quantity. And only then can we activate it in one country. Not even, the size of materials is so large. So I'm going to pivot quickly to my last section of thought, which is the wonderful podcast that you've been pursuing. And, I want to know the thought behind it, because it's really interesting, because it is Wise Women in Waste. And that is so interesting that you've taken such an important topic and yet many times overlooked. So what created that idea, and, how have you gone about it, and what is the plan with that?
That was really brainchild of my lovely colleague, Debbie Hitchen, and myself during lockdown. So we were on one of these Teams calls where you think, it's just really difficult. You can't really network. You can't go for coffee. And then we just got chatting and thinking, it's still really difficult as a woman in this industry. And also we noticed that our younger female colleagues were maybe sometimes lacking a bit of confidence, whereas their male counterparts were clearly demanding what they thought was due. So why is that? And also we have made our pathway, and we have reached this directorship and our recognition in the industry and in the company. So how can we share? How can we help? And that's really how it all came about. And then we decided on the podcast. And at the moment, it's still called Wise Women in Waste, but we might actually expand it out a bit. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to have really a platform to showcase female voices, and especially female expertise, really to showcase it exists, it's there, it's completely accessible, and even sometimes at women's conferences, you have in the panel 5 men and 1 woman, where you go, why? There must be somebody, there must be an expert, a female expert to do that. It's a bit out of frustration as well. And then we just really enjoyed ourselves. So similar to you, we have a bit on what pathways, and that has been super interesting. We had people who came literally, from landfill operator, regulator into the industry, people who went to a kind of like a combustion plant or power plant with their dad and got really fixed on engineering. We got philosophy, policy, politics students that got into waste. It's just wonderful, and it's really good fun to chat and have this conversation, and it's being listened to. And in a lot of our interviews, people are saying, then I listened to your podcast, and that is super nice. And the nicest thing was an interview for a new male colleague. He actually said, I really loved it because I learned so much, because nobody tells me these things, that is an issue. And from a male perspective, it's a super interesting, because I don't know, how can I know? And it's absolutely fine. It's that is so cool, and it's so lovely to hear that you actually thought, oh, this is super interesting. This is how these guys think. So it's great fun, and we do it regularly, and we have external guests, and we have fellow colleagues, and sometimes it's a bit more technical, sometimes it's a bit more philosophical. So we're trying to keep it fresh, and really also now do different languages, to make it more accessible in different languages, hopefully. So I'm not looking forward to my first German one, but I guess I will struggle through.
Oh, it's amazing, and I can totally relate to it as something that I started for a passion, and then of course it's become so enriching in so many ways. And what you are doing is again amazing. When I was 16, I looked up and prayed to whoever was up there that, I want to be surrounded by beautiful women. So I'm actually surrounded by 5 absolutely amazing women. I have 3 girls, my amazing wife, and my mother, who are all very, very powerful women. And I think that shaped my life so much. And of course, I can literally feel a pain in my heart along with the pride, because I also see the side of, how we made so many errors through history in terms of patriarchy and stuff like that. And it's so important that we address that, and at least in today's time, address it more and more. And these are little steps, right? Like by highlighting what you're doing. I as soon as I saw the name, I knew that I had no hope for your podcast. For myself, I meant. Because
we have male colleagues as well, so don't know. You might get a fair chance. We are really open.
But there were 2 things. There was wise and women. So both things were kind of challenging. Wisdom and women. That's a twofer. So getting to that is kind of tough. But yeah, I think it's really brilliant what you're doing. And connected to that is that how does one get more women into the industry? How do you think we make it more attractive so that there is more women coming into the world of sustainability and materials and recyclability and repurposing? I presume it's already happening, but how would you activate it more?
I think it is happening, and I think the key is fair recruitment processes. I think we all got an unconscious bias. So it's really having a recruitment process where you look at the capabilities and the references, and give people a chance to a certain degree apply blind. So we have like a bit of a when we recruit, we just get literally a description and answers to a set of questions we have put out for a certain purpose before we see the CV. So I've no idea if it's male or female, old or young, ethnicity, religion, no idea. And then we get the CVs when we think, from a skills level and expression and so on, this would fit with the position I'm recruiting for. And then we get the CVs and the interviews. I think it's also actively promoting diversity and celebrating that, and being very conscious that we need a bit of everything. So, for example, I had I had a 100% female project team. And actually, I was looking for a man, because I don't think it's good to have all women either. We need both perspective, both thoughts. And that's the same in terms of other diversity issues. So I really feel, because we're all different, and often we do like personality assessment, where you have a certain type of how you approach projects, how you work. And for every good project team, you want a variety. You want the detailed person that wants to do everything, and you want the big thinker, and you want the communicator and the organizer in there. Because if you only have a whole group of organizers, the creativity is clearly going to be going astray. So I think with that perspective, and then I truly feel that we need to support. So we need to support and enable, for example, for me to step back and have a younger colleague, ideally a female colleague, to say, you give the speech, I help you write it, but you're perfectly able to present it. And I was lucky enough, as I said, to have two and a number of more really fantastic male mentors that really helped me along and didn't judge me by my gender, but really by my capabilities. And I feel that that's the most important thing, to look at capabilities, and that maybe provide a bit of a confidence boost as well sometimes in terms of being supporting. And we all had done a bad experiences that weren't so nice. And I think the big change within the last 2 years with the Me Too movement is that we're allowing people to say, I really feel uncomfortable, you're having your arm on my elbow. That might have been meant really nice, but I don't like this physical contact. And I don't think I would have been confident enough to say that 10 years ago. But also enabling and schooling our colleagues to say, if you feel uncomfortable, be very polite, but also very determined. You don't need to apologize. You just need to state that I don't feel comfortable. Can you please take a step back? I don't need a kiss on the cheek. I don't know you that well, or any other side, and be very firm, but also very determined. And maybe also sometimes I think that helps for the male population to remind them that they have daughters, and if they would like their daughters to be treated like that, they should think about that, how they would like to, their mother, their wife, their daughters to be treated. And I find that's a very, very powerful image, because as you said, you got a certain expectations how your family would like to be treated, and sometimes people forget about that.
Yeah, and it's so important that there was a friend of mine, again, a very powerful woman who took me to this book called Defined by Design, and it opened my eyes, because, you just don't think, as a man, you don't think about how everything is designed by a man for men. and
seatbelts are one of the best things. So it's unbelievable.
There's so many things that, I keep seeing these lines outside a female toilet, and the male toilet will be totally free. And of course, you've made it the same size with a very different system. So it's crazy. And yeah, but okay, I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to just to take it towards closure. And usually there's a question that I ask on how would you think about scaling the company. I'm going to ask you a different one. How do you, because you're seeing a bigger, more holistic and a worldwide perspective as Anthesis, so how do you see the world changing in the next 10 to 20 years? And what because you would have more insight into what is really happening. And what is the positive landscape that you see? And if there is any, if you see any pitfalls, what are those in the next 10 to 20 years?
I think I see a lot of positive change. And I think looking at a positive impact or not having an impact, I think it's really the key how we need to look at the world. And at Anthesis, we are just developing our own impact strategy and our own impact framework, so we can really do what we preach to others and really assess our own view of the world and how we tackle that. I think my major concern is, can we do this quick enough, and how can we speed it up? Because time is not on our side, and how can we create really, really quick change? And for me, that might also then people to look at their standard of living, how we live, how we consume, how we see the world. And maybe standard of living is not everything, and consumption is not everything, and look more at interrelationship, especially after COVID and others. I think a lot of people looked more into their social relationship, where's purpose, what am I doing? And I think that's really the positive change. And in terms of technology and policy, there's a lot underway, but if we rely on market intervention or technology development, again, that's not a quick fix. So I think we really need to make sure that we work together, collaborate, and work in cooperation, because this is also not to be solved by one nation or by one company. So I think we need to work together, learn from each other, and really be open to learn and do the right thing. And that might not be the easy or the nice option. It might be a very difficult option.
Yeah, convenient. It definitely won't be the convenient option. Yeah, and I'm at least happy to hear that you see it more on the positive side than challenging side. So that's good to hear. And of course, my last question to you, is what does good garbage mean to you?
I think best garbage is no garbage. And the second one is probably recyclable garbage. So as recyclable or reusable as possible. So no garbage. That are products that don't create garbage for a very long time and then as easily recyclable as possible.
Super, Claudia. Thank you so much for being. This was literally like a masterclass for me. There was so much to learn from you and your experience. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom on this. I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person sometime and sharing more from you and learning more from you. Thank you for your time and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for all your questions and all your time and your enthusiasm and creating this really lovely atmosphere for the podcast. So it was an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.